Good morning, dear students. Welcome to the online session of BCA program for the subject System Software pertaining to third semester affiliated to Coimbatore University. So today we are discussing the session number 25. In the session number 25, we are discussing today about the title Macro Language and Macro Processor. And in this session, today we'll be discussing about what do we mean by macro, that is introduction to the macro. And in that, we'll be learning about what do we mean by macro instructions, features of macro facilities, and macro instruction arguments. So before starting with the unit number 3 about the macro, let us have a recap of our previous session. So in the last session, that is in the unit number 2, you have understood about the direct linking loaders, overlays, and the dynamic loading. So learning objectives of today's session. So in the today's session, the student will be able to understand the introduction of the macros, macro instructions, feature of the macro facility, and the macro instruction arguments. So ultimately, the session outcomes will be, the student will be able to understand what is a macro, how these macro instructions will be used, how to write a macro along with the features and the macro instruction arguments. So now let us get introduced to the what do we mean by a macro. So if dear students, you have remembered that in your C programming language you have learned something related to subroutines, and in the same way you have also learned something called as macros. So today now let's understand what do we mean by the macros in our system software there. See the macro as an abbreviation for a sequence of operation. I said subroutines. In the same way, with a single name you will be doing lot of operation there. So therefore we can tell a macro is an abbreviation for a sequence of operation. And this macro, it represents a commonly used group of statements in the source programming language. So this is very important. And we can also tell that a macro, it's a unit of specification for program generation through a process called as expansion. So remember this term, expansion. So a macro, how it is going to look? See, a macro, it consists of a name through which it has been identified, and it has a set of formal parameters and a body of code. So these are the three important parts and every macro has. So the use of a macro name with a set of actual parameters will be replaced by a code generated from its body. So with this introduction, let us see a simple syntax or a structure of a macro. So when coming to the syntax or a structure of a macro, it has four important parts. One is the start of the definition, then the name of the macro, then the sequence to be abbreviated, and the end of the definition. So for this, we'll have the example in the next slide there. So now, before going on to having an example of a macro, let us understand more about what is this macro instruction. We understood that every macro should have a name, and we have heard that the macro should have some instruction. So now these macro instructions are single line abbreviations for a group of instructions. The concept of macro instruction, normally we call it as a macro, where a single line abbreviation is used for a set of lines. For every occurrences of that single line, the whole block of the statements get expanded in the main source code itself. For example, let us have a program example wherein we see that we'll be having three set of statements, that is add instructions with your data, and they occur twice in our program. So the macro processor effectively constitutes a separate language processor with its own language. It provides a name to the sequence of statements. They are called as macro name that are repeated, and ever needed it may use the name in the main program. So this is the example which we are discussing now. So here you can see that we have written a source program which has the same statements being repeated twice there by using the blocks data. So we'll see how the macro is going to help when we have a program like this. The macro definition, it consists of following parts. Just in the previous slide we told about how the macro will be. So here we have a syntax there, how it is looking there. The first, you should have the start of a definition. See, to represent the start of a definition, we'll use the keyword called as macro. Then we should have the macro name, so which has to be represented, which has been shown here in the square brackets. Then next you should have the sequence of statements. It may be 1, 2 or any number of statements there. And very important thing is you should specify what is the end of a macro. So to specify the end of a definition of a macro, we use a keyword called as MEND, where MEND stands for macro end. Okay, now below you can see the source program of the previous example. See, now we have written macro macro, which is the first line which represents the start of the definition. Then we have incr, that means increment. Incr, it's a macro name given, it's a user defined macro, and in that we have the same 3 lines of code, and at the end we are writing what? Mend, that is macro end there. Now, whenever you want to have the same 3 statements repeated, you don't need to write them again and again. Directly, you can call the name of the macro by name incr. In the same way, in another part of the program also we have used incr. So this is how the macro will be used, and at the right end you can see that the expanded source will be whenever you are having incr, at the same place it will be replaced by the statement a1 comma data, a2 comma data, and a3 comma data. So rather than writing 3 times, you will be just including it with a single word called as incr, and this is the fundamental introduction and the use of a macro. So now let us get more information about this. See, in the definition of the macro and MEND, we have used these two, which are the pseudo code that represents the start and end of the macro definition. And the macro begins the first statement. The second statement begins with the name of the macro instruction, which is an identifier which will be used whenever the macro is called. And in our previous example, it is incr. The statement from the third till the MEND represents the body of the macro. So once the macro is defined, then the name of the macro instruction now acts as a mnemonic in assembly language. See, that is equivalent to the sequence of the statements, what we are discussing now. Now, whenever the macro instruction is encountered, the whole of the macro gets substituted in the place of the macro instruction. So in the previous slide, you just saw that whenever you are calling incr, it is been replaced with the 3 statements a1 comma data, a2 comma data, and 3 comma data. See, this process of substitution, it is technically called with a terminology called as macro expansion. So remember about this particular term, dear students, macro expansion. So this expansion takes place as the definition of the macro instruction is saved in the macro processor and is used whenever the macro instruction is encountered. A macro call represents the expansion of the macro in the source program. So now let us see the features of the macro. See, these macro instructions have got a lot of features depending upon which we are trying to design our macro processor, or we can say that the macro processor are designed in a manner to give the following feature to the macro instruction. Among them, the first important thing is macro instruction arguments. So dear students, please make a note of this macro instruction arguments. We always know that a macro instruction just expands the macro definition but does not allow any modification to the macro definition. But we can do the same with the data only with the help of the arguments. See, if we consider the example 2, we can see that the same set of statements make use of different data in each block there. For example, see, in the example 2, we have 3 statements being repeated again and again. At the below last 2 statement, you can see that, so data 1 and data 2 are being used in different blocks there. So in this case of macro is defined with the help of arguments called as dummy or macro instruction arguments. In the example, it is clear that the first block of statements make use of data 1 and the second set make use of data 2. So here in the macro definition, along with the macro name, the arguments are also defined and the statement in the body makes use of these arguments in the place of data. So you can see in the previous example, in the first macro call incr data 1 is the argument and the second macro call data 2 is the argument that is being passed. So this we can do by using these arguments only. We also make of label arguments that is used to define the label for a set of statements. The label arguments can be defined in 2 ways. That is, remember this one, we can define the label arguments in 2 ways. So first one is before the name of the macro, and if we do like that, it is called as positional arguments, or in the normal argument list, which we call it as dummy arguments. So dear students, we learnt about 2 things here. One is your what? Positional argument, another one is about dummy arguments. So whenever these kind of macros are called, the corresponding values in the calls are passed and the matching arguments in the definition. So in the example, you can see how the 2 different types of macros are being used there, that is positional and dummy there. So in this program, you can see that in the second line, we have incr, the macro name, followed by ampersand of argc. So here macro incr has 1 argument there. So, and in the calling of the macro, we have incr data 1, which uses the data 1 as operand, and incr data 2, which is going to use the data 2 as the operands, and they are being expanded shown in the right end of the particular program there. So I think you're clear about this example. In the same way, here I'm using incr again, but with 3 arguments, 1, 2 and 3, and at the preceded by ampersand of lab. So you can see there, when you're calling this incr, you're writing loop 1, and for incr 2, you're writing loop 2 with the same arguments but in different positions there. So according to your calling, the loop 1 will be using first data 1, data 2 and data 3, and loop 2 will be using data 3, data 2 and data 1. So this is what we are discussing here. Okay. So dear students, now we have understood the introduction to the macros, its features, and very important thing, the type of arguments there. Now let's have the MCQs for this. So the first MCQ for today's session is, the instruction format RR has a length of how many bytes? 2 bytes, 3 bytes, 4 bytes or 5 bytes? And the answer is 2 bytes. In the same way, the second MCQ is, in which of the following instruction format the instruction is 3 half words? Option A RX, option B RS, option C SI, option D SS. So in the SS instruction format, the instruction is 3 half words. Third MCQ, in which of the following instruction format the instruction is 1 half word? You have to remember these things. So in the RR instruction format, the instruction is 1 half word. And the fourth MCQ is, load multiple instruction is present in the following instruction format. That is, whether it is present in RR or RX or RS or SS. So it is present in your RS instruction format. And the last MCQ for today's session is, the instruction format SS has a length of how many bytes? It has a length of 6 bytes. So now we are into the summary part there. So in the today's session, the student has been able to understand about the introduction for the macros, what are the macro instructions with the syntax and the examples, features of the macro facility and the macro instruction arguments. So for further readings, dear students, you can refer the book authored by John Donovan, and the title of the book is